Hi, I'm Marcia Eckert, and I'm very excited to be here with Ruth Fidler. Ruth is an educational leader who has been a pioneer in the field of working with children who have what's called pathological demand avoidance. More about that title later. She's worked with these autistic children for over 35 years, and she has just an enormous amount, a wealth of information to share with us. So now it's morning for me. Good morning, Ruth. Good afternoon, Ruth.
Yes. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for inviting me to join you today.
Well, we're just really grateful to have you. I'd like to maybe first ask you to talk about your career and what brought you to what you're doing.
Yes, sure. Well, it started quite a long time ago, 1989 to 90. And really, I was starting to do some voluntary work, and then I was studying, and then I began my career in schools in the UK. And I was coming across some young people who were developing differently, should we say. And they were sort of falling outside that sort of usual, typical expectation that schools had of the profile of those young people. And I was just fascinated by those youngsters, and I just felt, gosh, these are really great individuals, and I so enjoyed spending time with them, that it sort of all grew from there. Then I spent some time working in a specialist school where I was a senior leader for quite a long time, and developed my specialism there really in children with PDA profiles, children with more complex presentations of autism, so autism where it overlaps with other conditions. And then moving on from there, for the last 10 years or so, I've worked independently with children and young people from the age of 5 to 25 all over the UK. And I provide training and consultation and strategic development for various children's services and districts. And I'm still fascinated by it, and I'm still really enjoying it, and really enjoying the people that I meet. I feel very lucky.
That's incredible, that you have such a breadth of not only understanding, but also application, because that's so important to so many, I'm sure, of the educators, parents, other professionals, everybody listening, that it's not just theoretical, it's also how to work best. There's a lot of confusion out there because to many people, PDA or pathological demand avoidance is a new idea. So could you possibly just help people understand what is PDA?
Yes, sure. And I realize there's a bit of a gap, or maybe a time lag between awareness in the UK and awareness in America. But firstly, what I also want to point out is that the UK is not one homogenous group of professionals and families who all share exactly the same view on, well, probably on autism, least of all on PDA. But yes, it's not quite such new news here for us. And in that regard, it was based on the original work done by Professor Elizabeth Newson in the 1980s, who at that time was seeing children and young people who were coming to her psychology and research service. And she felt that she was meeting a group of children who were reminiscent of children with autism, but there was something that was qualitatively different about these children. And then she had her light bulb moment of realizing, oh, but actually they're like each other. And that's when she felt that she had identified what we would now view as a profile, an autism profile of PDA. So very much it has its roots, both historically and in terms of our understanding of the profile in autism. And that means that we would expect to see some of those key areas of difference that we would see in other autistic young people, well, individuals. those differences in social interaction and social communication, those differences in information processing, and those sensory processing differences as well. But what we might see in somebody who has a PDA profile is they just present with a slightly different expression. But that's where we would be looking for our roots and our sort of anchoring of PDA. And then if we come to think about where PDA is distinctive, really we're talking about it being a hypersensitivity to everyday demands and expectations. And crucially, those are very much outside that range of ordinary, because we can all be demand avoidant, some of us more so than others, and we are not surprised if we or somebody we know is demand avoidant about something that they find aversive for some reason, or that they're fearful of, or something that they're conscious they don't know how to do, so they're lacking in confidence. Those are very ordinary things to be demand avoidant about. But for this group of children and young people, we're talking about an avoidance that falls outside that. So it can not only be as a response to external demands of a parent or a teacher saying, come over here, do this, put that there, but it would also include internally generated demands, those sort of things where a young person might think, well, I know I asked to do that, but now the moment's come to do it, I'm finding it too hard to manage. It would also include things that are within that young person's capability. So that can be quite counterintuitive to the adults supporting them, especially where you hear particularly teachers say, but I know they can do it, and they did it yesterday, and they might do it tomorrow. So why are they saying they just can't do it today? And what I would say in response to those questions is, yes, you're right, they can do it. Therefore, it's correct to ask why, but it's not correct to answer that with a judgment. We need to be open-minded about why we're asking that question, and we need to recognize that something else is getting in the way for them right now. And what is that thing? And invariably, it's because this hypersensitivity to demands has been triggered, and then our young people are getting stuck or really anxious, and that's what's going on for them.
You know, when you say hypersensitivity and getting stuck, that's very accepting and non-judgmental. I would think that these children run into judgment all the time in terms of being perceived as oppositional, and you know, people getting frustrated with them. And so these children must get a lot of negative judgment and negative responses.
Yes, which is deeply unhelpful, particularly because they are often very conscious that this is something that they know they can do, or they ought to do, or maybe they even want to do, and they don't want to let themselves down or disappoint the people around them. So to be met with judgment actually just exacerbates the problem, because it increases their stuckness, if you like, and it increases their anxiety around it all. And I would sort of come back to a couple of things, really. One is that the way that PDAs tend to avoid is, it might be a no, it might be on occasion a direct, something that feels a bit more oppositional, but often it's something that's more what we would describe as socially strategic. And that's because these children know that they need to sort of soften that avoidance. So it might be that they will try and distract you and go, oh, that's a nice jacket you're wearing, I wonder what it would look like with my dress, I'll just try that on while you do this piece of work. Or it might be that they procrastinate, or they renegotiate the renegotiations, often to the point where supporting adults can't even remember where they started, least of all why they started. That they will use all sorts of interests to sort of divert attention, and using all of those social strategies is actually indicative not only that this is not simply an outright no, but there's something else, there's another subtlety going on here. But also leads me to my other point, which is that Elizabeth Newson used to talk to us a lot about the point of a diagnosis, not being to judge a child, not being to label a child, but it was there in order to, what she described as, make sense of a child, on the basis that if we can make sense of a child and work out what makes sense to a child, then we can start putting in some effective strategies.
There are some who might say that the very name pathological demand avoidance suggests a judgment, suggests negative. And I wondered, is there controversy over the name?
Well, I would rather than call it controversy, I'd rather suggest there's sort of lively discussion about the name. But yes, there is some push and pull around that. And I'm glad you've asked, because actually there are a couple of things I want to say in that regard. Firstly, to remember that word was used initially by Elizabeth back in the 1980s, which, things shift and change over time. How we use language and the connotations that come with language change over time, don't they? But when Elizabeth was using that word, the definition that she wanted to get across to people was that if this was happening in a pathological way, what that meant was it was happening to a degree and an extent that was outside the range of ordinary to a clinically significant extent. And she was also talking about something that if it's pathological in its nature, then that means it's an integral part of that individual's neurology. It's not something that they're choosing. It's not something that they're doing as a deliberate, I'm going to be difficult here. It's something that is just part of who they are, part of their wiring, if you like. And if we think about it from that point of view, actually, I think it does the job still, because it does describe something that is outside the range of ordinary, and it does describe something that is beyond the active choice of that individual. Now, there are some people who prefer to refer to PDA as pervasive drive for autonomy, because there is a bit of reluctance to use that word pathological, which, as I say, was never intended to pathologize a young person, and certainly is not used by practitioners like myself in order to do that. Now, the thing about pervasive drive for autonomy, and sometimes I get people saying, well, can't you just change the name of it, Ruth? And I'm like, no, I can't just on my own change the name and decades of research around it and all of those sorts of things. I prefer to view it as to use the terminology pathological demand avoidance, but the way it expresses itself is as a pervasive drive for autonomy. And then we've sort of got scope for both of those formulations, if you like. But I would also point out that if you do describe it as a pervasive drive for autonomy, there's sort of an implication there that you're talking about somebody who is choosing that's right, what they're driven to, and I think then we slightly lose something of Elizabeth's original key intention there.
Right. I mean, I think one of the important points that you made that's critical for people to understand is exactly what you said, that there's a neurological basis I mean, to put it in a very, casual way, that something about wiring that makes someone's, say, perception of threat get triggered. in this particular way. And it's not just that they are striving for something by choice or something, that this is literally a brain response of a threat response being triggered.
Yes, absolutely. And I know some individuals with PDA profiles, young people and adults, who say exactly that, who say that they feel that they perceive so many things in their everyday environment as if they were threats, even when cognitively they know that they're not, but that's how they're perceiving them. And that's not only, as I said earlier, the external demands of everyday life, but it's also even it might be something that's an internal physical sensation. It might be that I know one lady with a PDA profile who says she needs to eat before she gets really hungry, because once she gets really hungry and her stomach is rumbling, that rumbling is interpreted as too demanding, and then she finds it really hard to eat. So, we really are, for some individuals, talking about that way outside the range of ordinary responses. And
Yeah,
she knows that doesn't make sense, and she knows about eating and nutrition and when is a good time to eat and how much is a good idea to eat. She knows all of that.
I think what you're saying is so important, because one of the ways that some people might approach this is, okay, well, if she's thinking that this is a this is a this is a threat, that therefore you could go at it in a cognitive way to say, well, we're going to use a cognitive method to address um, cognitive distortions. But actually trying to go at these as cognitive distortions is not going to be helpful at all. And I'm wondering if you could talk about, well, how do you help a child or an adult navigate having PDA?
Well, I think some of the work that we do, particularly with children whilst they're younger and whilst they're developing self-awareness, is a lot of detective work. So we're trying to figure out what is in fact going on for a child. So they might be in the middle of doing an activity that seems to be going very, very well, and that they're being successful at and engaged in, and actively and calmly enjoying. And then maybe something happens, like they suddenly need the toilet even, or something changes in their sort of their mood and their agitation levels. They might not be able to tell us about that at that point in their life. So that's where we need to do a lot more detective work to try and figure that out. But as our children get older, that is a really core part of their learning. I would say that is a really key element of their curriculum, is learning about themselves, learning how to interpret what's going on internally for them, what's going on cognitively for them, how they're feeling at any time, giving them the emotional vocabulary to be able to navigate and express those things, and also helping them learn their own strategies. Probably most of us, and assuming most of your listeners are adults by that age, most of us will have our own suite of our own menu of recipes that we use to keep ourselves regulated. And maybe we've never even said them out loud to another person. We just carry them with us. But we've developed those over time. And I think for our PDA and many of our autistic young people, we need to work with them on that much more actively, so that they can be more conscious of that. And that includes things like helping them develop emergency exits when they're in a difficult situation. Because as adults, we have an awful lot of emergency exits available to us. If you just said to me right now, even though we're recording this for your summit, if you said, "Oh, I'm really sorry, I've just got to go," I'm not going to stop you. I might be concerned for you, and I might wonder where you've gone and are you all right, but I'm not going to prevent you doing that. But for our children, especially in schools, there are so many requirements around them all the time. And what I see is that if children are not given legitimate and flexible emergency exits that they can use, they end up finding one somewhere. So they'll end up doing something that forces an emergency exit to open up. And what we want is we want to avoid children being put in that situation. We want them to be able to access those things in a calm and a timely way.
When you talked about the trigger being the perception of a demand as a threat or an ask as a threat, because it might not be perceived by the person who is asking as a demand, but rather an ask or even a suggestion. I reading your book, I was impressed that there's a lot to understand about how one presents an idea or help someone think about an idea that might be less triggering.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm really pleased that leapt out of the pages at you. So that's really nice feedback. Thank you. And it is very much about that perception of a demand. So if somebody has a hypersensitivity and is hyper alert, hyper vigilant to something, they're going to be on the lookout subconsciously and consciously, and be much more responsive, over responsive, you might even say. So we need to be really conscious about how we're coming across and where a young person might have perceived demands. So often I hear families say things like, oh yes, he's really tuned into, mum always has that look on her face just before she starts going on about the bedtime routine, or they might have picked up that a family member or a parent has started doing a few of the things around the house that are indicators that we're going to try and get you in the car to take you to school now, whether that's that I've locked the back door, or I've fed the cat, or I've put my keys in my bag, all of those little indicators, they might be processing as perceptions of demands. Alongside what we were talking about earlier about those internal ones. And so we can use a lot of low-key everyday approaches that will just, what I describe as kind of take the sting out of the demand, that rather than saying to a child, I'm expecting you to do this, whether that's literally or by implication, you have a more invitational approach. So you're sort of putting out there hey, how about it? And even if you are hanging on to something that is your core expectation or request for that child, you can still wrap a lot of invitation around the edges. So if you're wanting your child to put their shoes on because you need to go out, and maybe it's somewhere that actually they're not quite so resistant to going to, but you're thinking that putting shoes on could be a bit problematic, you can wrap some invitation around that. Do you want to put your shoes on here or there? Do you want to put your shoes on in the house or in the car? Do you want to put your trainers on or your boots on? And just giving a little bit more of that control, that flexibility, that collaboration can be really, really helpful. One of the ways that we often use to describe this is by using the analogy of two radio dials, like two old-fashioned frequency dials, and thinking about one of those dials measuring the child's sensitivity to demands, and that's going to measure their sensitivity to direct demands as well as those indirect and perceived and environmental demands. And then the other dial is measuring how much demand the supporting adults and the environment is giving out. And ideally, we want to be in a position where we synchronize those dials. So if the child's tolerance to expectations increases, that's great. We can nudge our dial up a little bit, but we need to be remaining tuned in very tightly to our young people, because their mood lability is part of that diagnostic profile. So we shouldn't be surprised if there are sudden mood swings. And if their dial drops, ideally we want to shift ours. Now, we're not always going to be able to synchronize them perfectly, partly because we're only human and we're sometimes going to get that wrong, but also depending what the circumstances are and what the child would ideally like to happen, that might not be an option, or it might not be safe to do that. But what we can do is we can be conscious of it, we can try and amend our dial, and as soon as we've got past that initial incident of that might be challenging safety, the next thing I would say to do is synchronize your dials again and repair any relational rift that might have happened during that incident.
There's so much in this, and I want to explore it further. But another of the points in your book, and I can't recommend your book on navigating PDA in America highly enough. I don't. It's not just applying to America, but so many of these ideas are spelled up in such just clear, helpful detail. And so that's why I'm going to add in one of them, which was the idea that you need a person to be trusted. That you talk about adults, all adults aren't necessarily equal, and how important it is to have some people be trusted.
Yes, that's very, very true. And I suppose this is not new news to any of us, because if any of us was asked to do something that was slightly outside our comfort zone, for whatever reason, we're going to find that easier to do. We're going to be more reassured if we have a trusted person alongside us, somebody who we feel is on our team and believes in us, and somebody who is going to be there to catch us if we fall and sort of nudge us on a little if we need it. So it's just an augmented or exaggerated version of that. And having that hypersensitivity to demands is going to be really mitigated by those positive, trusted relationships. So sometimes I find myself having conversations with school settings where I say to them, don't worry about whether you've got a sensory room or a hydrotherapy pool or whatever, because actually the most precious resource you have is the people. So that's what you need to invest in.
Yeah, I'd like to address different contexts, because when you're talking about home and you're talking about a parent who might be very tuned in and realize, for example, that a child might not want to put their boots on, or that might not want to eat breakfast, and you can invite them to do what you want them to do, but in a way that gives the child a sense of choice and control. And the child knows that you're not judging them or getting angry at them, but rather, with them. And that's, in a home context. How is this done in a school context? Usually there's a lot of expectations, there's a curriculum, there's lots of,
Yeah.
you have to be here doing this right now. And
Yeah.
so
I think there is absolutely, and I'm really happy to come on to that. There's just one more thing that occurred to me that I want to say about families and parents, is that actually parents also feel quite a lot of pressures, that they have pressures, whether those are coming from their extended family or from friends or from those social pressures of my next door neighbor's children seem to be coping quite effortlessly with this whole going to school phenomenon, and why is that difficult in our household? And so it's not true that they don't have a lot of their own pressures. And I think families are likely to feel quite a high level of scrutiny as well. And I think that can bring some of its challenges, because scrutiny is not always done for understanding. Sometimes scrutiny is done with a hint of judgment, which is obviously not helpful. And some of our PDAs may be really very different at home to how they are at school. And they might be holding things together at school and masking and coping on the surface, but actually they're really struggling. And then all of that sort of falls away when they come home. And it can be really difficult for families who feel that the child they're living with is quite a different child to the one that school staff are seeing. And what I would say to school staff in that context is it's really important to listen to families and to believe them, because they're telling you their experience of their child. And presumably school staff want other people to listen to their experience of that same child. Therefore, it makes sense to have a holistic view and look at how a child is across all settings. And that's where you'll start to really make some difference in that idea of making sense of a young person and seeing them in the round, not just in a slot of the day. So to move on from that to schools, and you ask about how schools can be more flexible. And yes, you're right, schools tend to be quite prescriptive in how they work, whether that's even just the timetable and the curriculum. In the UK, often it's even including the school uniform. So it's not just where you sit in a class, it's what you wear while you sit in that class. And there can be all sorts of challenges from that point of view. But there can be flexibility. There usually is enough scope somewhere within those systems if the attitude and the ethos in a school is in a helpful place. Having worked in so many different areas now and seen so many different school settings, from a tiny little school in the Scottish Highlands that had just forest outside the back door and the ocean outside the front door to purpose-built, really sort of all shiny and brand new autism-friendly buildings in major cities. I've seen children have their needs beautifully met and dreadfully met in all types of settings. So what that tells us is it's not actually about the building or the facilities. It's back to this thing, it's about the attitude and the approaches. And if those approaches are non-judgmental, if they're collaborative, if they're holistic, if they are flexible and creative, and if there's a genuine willingness to question systems rather than just assume, well, that's how we always do it, then those are the places where PDAs can be very successful, and those are the schools that can be very effective. And that doesn't need any money or funding, it needs a shift in attitude.
Well, I would think then there'd have to be, again, a kind of paradigm shift toward flexibility in, say, structure or flexibility in presentation. So that, for example, I'm using one of your examples actually, but if a PDA child didn't want to do maths right at that moment, but was willing to do history, that there might be some flexibility in what the child chooses to do when.
Yes, yes. Yes, absolutely. And you might still feel that it's reasonable to set up some sort of parameters so that you say, well, we'd like to encourage this young person to not always choose history over maths. But that is their interest, or maybe that's the thing that regulates them. And therefore doing 20 minutes of history in order to get them regulated and in the right headspace to then do the maths, actually, what's not to like? Because you've got them involved in the maths and you've done some extra learning. Whereas in a parallel universe, you can imagine that somebody else might have used that first 20 minutes in quite confrontational, unhelpful conversations with that young person, trying to push them into the maths rather than just travel what I call the scenic route rather than the Google Maps route. And and that's often more effective.
So
And it's kinder.
I would think it takes some people in the school who really, really have taken the time to understand this particular child, and perhaps who are working with others to help them understand the child.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And so those key individuals are going to benefit from having some training and time to reflect, time to liaise, time to be able to think a bit differently and a bit more creatively, because the school systems tend to be set up where there's a bit of a formula. It takes less effort, less energy to just follow the formula. And it's not that people can't travel either side of that formula, but they need a bit of support and they need a bit of time to be able to do that.
I would think support, both administrative support from the administrative levels of the school, supporting someone to be more flexible, but also parental support. There has to be kind of a level of trust, not just between the child and the adults, but also among the adults for, the changes that are being adapted.
Yes, yeah. But the same as for the child with a PDA profile, that relationship of trust between professionals and families has to be worked on. You can't just turn up and say, well, I know that I'm highly principled and I'm a nice person, so I'm expecting that family to trust me immediately. That is another part of the relationship, whether that's parents and therapists or parents and teachers, any other professionals. And bearing in mind that we need to understand what that family's previous experience of professionals has been. So there might be some families who've actually had really quite a difficult childhood experience of professionals themselves, or difficult experience at school themselves. So that leaves a legacy. And then specifically in relation to the child that they're parenting right now, they may have come across some wonderful professionals, and they may have come across some who were much more difficult to deal with, and where they didn't feel heard and understood. So that's all got to be taken into account as well.
It all takes time to listen and understand and communicate that understanding, and a lack of judgment. Because as you said, I think so accurately, so often parents feel judged either by, by other parents or by their extended family, or sometimes by schools. You haven't gotten your child to behave the way I want them to. And so they have to have trust that this is someone who's not going to be judging me.
Yes, absolutely. And particularly in schools, for educators to realize that even if you're the teacher who sees that child for the first lesson of the day, that's not the first thing that child's done that day. So they will have had to have coped with all sorts of sensory experiences and all sorts of demands to get them from the state of I was asleep in my bed to now I'm walking through the door in the school. And so just bearing in mind, we need to know what's gone before. We need to fundamentally be aware of what we don't know and not make assumptions. And that's again where maybe it's helpful to just have that first slot of when a teacher sees a child that day, or when the child first arrives at school, to just help them settle and ground, feel safe, feel seen, and then we'll start the day.
When you bring that up, it strikes me how important something that would be to, autistic children in general can have trouble with transitioning. And we're talking about a group of children who might have even more trouble with transitioning, and how important that entry into the day might be, as much as the transitions throughout the day. Are there some schools that are actually designed to work with these children, and that are either structured differently, or that you've been in, that you think have made changes that really help this group of children?
Yes, there are. And again, I don't want to give the impression that those are all specialist settings, because some of them are, but they're not all. Um, it's more usual to see that where you have a degree of specialism and a degree of understanding of autism, um, but it doesn't have to be the case. And it might be that just that child's journey to school is done in a different way, where maybe rather than them being met at the door at school, that a trusted member of staff meets them on their walk into school from further away and walks in with them, and then sort of smooths over the sharp edges of that transition. So rather than it being feeling a bit more of a cliff edge, they'll meet them and they'll start chatting. Oh, let me tell you about that thing I saw on YouTube last night while we walk into school. That's using that invitational approach that teachers or that whoever they are, the supporting adult, their goal is to get this young person calmly and safely into school. But how they do it, you can have all sorts of flexible, creative, invitational approaches to doing that.
Are the schools you know, you mentioned that there are some schools that are specialized. Do they have any difference in terms of how they're structured or scheduled?
Probably the biggest difference might be in some of their organizational stuff. So they would need to have a timetable, because it's pretty hard to run a school without any kind of timetable. But they might say, well, on that timetable today, that young person or that group of young people are going to be in that part of the school with these teachers for this length of time. So that's your structure. But then the flexibility within that is that they also might have access to the hall or the playground if they need it. And what they're doing in that is they might be doing some project-based work. So they might have 2 or 3 different pieces of work there, or interests that they are working on, and in the moment they can choose which one of those they do on that day. So you've got this combination of structure that helps organizationally and helps those PDAs feel safe, because there's a degree of predictability there, but you've also got some flexibility within it.
I can imagine one thing some parents or educators might be thinking right now is, well, what is there a development that you see, whether it's a maturational process or a learning process? In other words, can PDAers look toward going to college, going to work in settings where they're not necessarily going to have someone trusted helping them navigate so much?
Um, yes, I think there's absolutely no reason not to expect that. I think it's important to reflect that on any other typically developing child's future trajectory, we don't know what's going to happen for them either. So I think we allow ourselves to make assumptions about typically developing children, but they are assumptions, and it's all a bit of an unknown what lies ahead for any of our young people, isn't it? It might mean that they access college or paid employment in a slightly different way. It might mean that they access it a bit later than their peer group, or long-term relationships. But it doesn't mean that they can't have access to those things. And I certainly know a number of adults who are in committed relationships who have paid work, but there is some flexibility around how that's done, and who have been able to sustain college placements, but they might have ended up needing an extra semester, or maybe even an extra year, because of struggling to manage with some of the assignment or assessment deadlines. but it certainly wouldn't rule it out, I would say, if that's what those young people want in their future. In fact, I've been been invited to 2 PDA weddings in the last few years. So that's a joy.
Well, hopefully they say yes.
Yes, they did. They did. Yes.
You know, you've talked about, and I think I want to go, loop back to this because it's so important, helping the children initially, and then, and this would be true as one becomes an adult, become very self-aware of internal states, and to have tools for recognizing that, for example, my dial is beginning to go direction, and do I have tools that help me kind of, I think you called it a window of tolerance, that help me have more tolerance. And it just seems to me so important. My experience with other kids is that obviously different tools for different people, but how critical that is to helping a child discover what those are that work for them.
Absolutely. And sometimes we change something that used to regulate us 5 years ago, doesn't work anymore. We need something different. Sometimes we need to try something out because it's worth a try, but actually that's not a suitable one for us. And we might need different things for different circumstances. Sometimes our gold standard as a regulator isn't available because we're not at home or we're away on holiday or something. So it's having a good enough toolbox that is that it is a good fit for a variety of circumstances. It's not easy for PDAs to develop that sort of interoception and that awareness of, oh, I'm feeling this. I'm getting a bit more sweaty, or I can feel my heart rate changing and I'm struggling to sit still. That might mean that I'm anxious, and that might mean that it would be a good idea for me to do such and such at this time. I think one other thing that I've talked a lot to a lady called Julia Daunt, who's an adult PDA, and I wrote one of the books with her a couple of years ago. She talks a lot about needing recovery time. So having this sort of ongoing cycle of doing an activity, then recovering from it, then preparing for the next one, then doing the next one. And depending what each activity is, some of them require more recovery time or more preparation time than others. And that's something now as an adult, she is able to manage much better, because adults have a lot more control and influence over their lives. And because she's now in her early 40s, so her self-awareness is much more robust than it was even 20 years ago. But that's something else I think we don't always give children enough recovery time. So if a child has done something that has been really quite draining for them, it's very helpful to look at. Don't just assume, oh, great, we did that. Right, we're on a roll. Keep going, because maybe you can quite quickly tip them into being too flooded with expectations, and that's too exhausting for them. And then those young people risk emotionally crashing.
Right.
And one of the problems with school is that if you had a brilliant day yesterday or a dreadful day yesterday, you're still going to be expected to come at the same time and in the same frame of mind again tomorrow. So I think we need to look within schools and within timetables at where we might need some of that recovery time. I think that's probably true for a lot of neurodivergent students and other autistic students as well, to help them manage that cycle of recovery.
I think you also mentioned self-advocacy is important, and I want to make sure we bring that up.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's very much part of this developing self-awareness, to know what works for for them as a young person, and to be able to express what they would like, even if they don't have a vision of how to get to that place, or even if they feel like that's quite a way off. So don't push me there too quickly, but I want you to know that I have got some views and I have got some aspirations. To also help our young people understand that advocating for yourself is very much about expressing your wishes, and your views on things, but that we need to give them opportunities so they can make informed choices, asking them what they might like to do as a further education subject, or to attend a different school or college placement or something. If they've got no experience of what those places are like, then that's really hard for them to make those decisions, isn't it? And also for them to understand that being able to advocate for yourself is not about being confrontational. So there's this element of collaboration that runs through it all. And in my personal experience of knowing the PDAs that I've known over my career, there is invariably a recognition that I know I find it more comfortable to be in control, but I also realize it's not reasonable, it's not kind, and it's not sustainable to be in control of everything all the time. So I'm not actually trying to do that because I want to be dominating. This is it. I suppose it's back to that integral part of that person's wiring, isn't it? So there's often a wish to be collaborative, but maybe some difficulty around achieving that.
Right. So the idea is to help someone kind of be able to get that collaboration they might want themselves, but have difficulty getting to. One of the things that strikes me is that there's so much to this. There's so much depth to all the things that you're discussing. And what we can do in an hour is quite limited. And you've had a marvelous books that you've written. And I wondered if you'd say a little bit about the books and which books people who are dealing with PDA children or who want to become more knowledgeable would be, helpful to them. And that would be great because I do
Oh,
to know about your books.
okay, thank you. Um, well, I would say that any of them would be relevant to families, because that just runs through the whole ethos, really. There are some that might be more use or interest to educators, and that's the Understanding PDA, which was the original book, the Collaborative Approaches to Learning, because that has some specific emphasis on engagement with learning. And then if you are in America, the new one, Navigating PDA in America, because that's a bit more specific to American systems. There's also Can I Tell You About PDA, which I think is helpful for families and for siblings and possibly for children themselves with a PDA profile. But it's very hard to ever feel that there's something that you can just pull off the shelf and that does exactly what you want it to do. Most things are going to need some adaptation and some interpretation around them. So I would always say to families, don't present your child with any reading material that you haven't read yourself first and thought through quite carefully. And then I mentioned the lady called Julia Daunt earlier, and we wrote a book together called Being Julia a few years ago, which is her story and her experience of her PDA profile. And in fact, in that book, I've just remembered she says something about her long-term partner, that she says something like, well, I've been telling him to propose to me for years and he's not done it yet. Well, theirs was one of the weddings this summer, so he has done it, and she did say yes, and they are now happily married.
That's great to hear. Well, it's been, this has just been absolutely fascinating, because just as so many autistic children of all kinds aren't particularly well understood in schools, I think the PDAers in particular aren't understood, as you said, because things can be so different, and the perception can not totally get the idea that this is wiring, and this is, we all kind of, our responses to threat are similar in terms of the physiological response, but what triggers that response and to what degree can be very different. And understanding these children with that lens is so important. Are there one or two thoughts you want to be sure that our participants take home?
Well, just I suppose in summary, thinking about some of those, like you say, those concluding bullet points, is to remember that PDA is part of autism. So they're not separate things, that the roots of PDA profiles lie within autism. To remember the importance of emotional well-being, supporting that self-awareness and building towards self-advocacy, particularly with this always having a view to the future, and doing what we can to promote positive adult outcomes for our children and young people. The importance of relationships, of building trusting relationships with them, and that those key people in their lives are really significant, and those key people within schools are your biggest resource. So find those people, nurture those relationships, and support those individuals. Also, maybe something that we didn't really talk about is prioritizing. So deciding what you're going to focus on, knowing why you've chosen that as a high priority, and then actively and collaboratively letting other things go. So that doesn't mean that you're going to ignore them forevermore, but it means right now, for these reasons, we're going to let that thing go whilst we focus on some other things. And then we'll come back and review it. And all the time using those collaborative, flexible, indirect approaches.
I think your point about prioritization is so important, because I find that, at least working in schools here, that sometimes there are certain things that become what we would call sacred cows. You must show your work in math, and that becomes die. And being able to sort of have very few of those, that you understand that that might be important, but it doesn't have, I mean, it's more important to be trusted and to engage the child, have that
Yes.
particular moment.
Yeah, and to use that example, that if you have that child to feel safer and supported by somebody that they trust, they're more likely to then be able to show they're working in their maths, because they can sit alongside somebody who says, oh, well, I didn't get that answer, or I did it a different way. And let me show you how I did mine, and you show me how you did yours, and get the child maybe to tutor somebody else. And that's how you can just be a bit more indirect and shift the emphasis, shift the perception of that demand. So you still get what is going to be in that child's best interests in terms of their learning outcomes, but you've gone about it in a different way.
Well, this has been an absolutely fascinating talk, and I deeply regret I can't tell everybody that they can come running to you from all over the world, because this is a world summit, that your work is in the UK, but your books bring these ideas to life in an incredibly vivid and understandable way. Thank you so much for it being understandable. And I'm so grateful for this talk. It's just been absolutely lovely talking to you.
Yes, and you too. And thank you so much for inviting me. And I hope everybody really enjoys the rest of the summit.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.